Joining us on the show today is Gary Lachman, here to talk about his new book on Madame Blavatsky, the mother of modern spirituality. Pleasure to have you with us today, Gary. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me on.
Joining us from London, freezing cold over there, I hear.
Yeah, it's very, very chilly this morning.
We love the book. I kind of got about 75% of the way through this morning, and Aaron and I were discussing just how much is in here and how incredible this woman's life was. But it's strange. We talk about occult topics on Mysterious Universe all the time, but Madame Blavatsky isn't so well known. When did you first come across her and her writings?
Well, I first came across reference to Blavatsky in the mid-'70s, about 1975, when I was first playing in music in New York. And I was living with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein in rundown loft space on the Bowery.
Right, as our listeners, we should point out, you were, of course, a founding member of the band Blondie.
Yeah, I was a founding member of Blondie, and we were freezing and poor on the Bowery, a few blocks away from CBGB, the club.
Yeah.
And Chris had a kind of kitschy pop interest in sort of the occult and voodoo and black magic and witchcraft, and he wasn't really into it, but he had, it was a kind of he was into sort of all the paraphernalia, the imagery and all that. And also a lot of what I call kind of debris from the previous generation, the 60s generation was around. And people were into reading about Aleister Crowley a lot, and there was a book of his, Diary of a Drug Fiend, that everybody was reading and so on. But there were quite a few other books on the occult, and one was a book by Colin Wilson, called The Occult, that had come out, I think, about 1971. And I had never really been interested in it before. I was interested in, the closest thing I was interested to that was sort of like horror fiction and weird fiction and H.P. Lovecraft, but I didn't take any of it, really seriously. But for some reason, I just picked that up and started reading it, and it really grabbed me. And so I got it. And then in the midst of this book, where him talking about Crowley and Rasputin and Gurdjieff and Kabbalah and all this different stuff, was Madame Blavatsky. And so she was in there. And yes, that was sort of the first reference I came across to her.
In the book, you describe, when you picked up some of her works, your reaction to it was very similar to ours. When we came across Blavatsky and we thought, oh, this is going to be great material for our show. And, we opened up her large tome and thought, we'll just transcribe some of this for the show. It'll be great.
Like, wow.
But it was so heavy. I mean, it was really hard. It's hard to digest. So did you have the same kind of reaction? Did it take you a while to come back to Blavatsky and kind of, absorb what she had written? Yeah,
I mean, there was just so much information coming from the books, and then the whole atmosphere around it seemed a bit kind of quaint. And as I say in the book, seemed the kind of thing that, sort of grandmothers might talk about over tea on a Sunday afternoon, and nonchalantly, discussing reincarnation and astral travel. And it didn't seem to have quite the edge that I had found in some of the other people that Wilson was talking about in this book.
Right. But it seems like you came back to Blavatsky eventually, and you said that all roads eventually led back to her. Why was that the case?
Well, what happened is, many years later when I started writing about all this stuff, I became very interested in the history of it. And once you start to do a little bit of research into the history of, what do you want to call it, occultism or esotericism, pretty much everything does go back to her into the 19th century. So much of what we see as the New Age or kind of popular occultism and so on, more or less emerged from her ample bosom, as it were. She really popularized it. She turned it into something that was the interest of a few people, like on the margins of society, into a worldwide kind of movement when she founded the Theosophical Society. And so many people came out of that background. Later on, developed into teachers in their own right.
I'm concerned because she isn't as relatively well known as some of the other characters, that there will be portions of our audience who are thinking, who on earth is Madame Blavatsky? Who is this woman? So if you could put a label on her, how would you describe her and her influence on modern spirituality? I
mean, that's one of the questions I raise in the book. Who was Madame Blavatsky? Even people that know about her sort of have a slightly inaccurate kind of picture of her, but the basic facts as we know them: she was born in the Ukraine and Russia in 1831 into a sort of family in the minor nobility. And by the time she was about 17 or 18, she ran away from an unconsummated marriage with an older man, where she gets her last name Blavatsky from, Nikifor Blavatsky. And she went on this long kind of wander around the world, basically, for the next 20 years in search of mystic knowledge. She had become fascinated with this occult library that great-grandfather had. She started reading these books, and she also claimed to have had strange experiences in her youth, in her childhood, sort of visions and encounters with spirits and memories of past lives and things like that.
There was a mention that during her childhood she would have special imaginary friends she would call the hunchbacks, and she would whisper to herself of worlds unseen, of worlds before.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's again, a lot of this stuff, it's retrospective too, because you hear about these stories after she had already established herself, so it's unclear exactly how much she kind of added to it, in order to help create her legend, how much is just strict fact. But the basic story is that, yes, she grew up, she had kind of psychic abilities as a child, discovered this occult library, and her great-grandfather was involved in Russian Freemasonry in the late 18th century.
Interesting.
And part of it had this kind of political side to it. There were these plans for this kind of transformation of Europe, and sort of a utopian kind of vision of a free society, progressive, liberal, and so on, trying to overthrow the control that the church and the monarchy had on Europe, and so on and so on. So she became really inspired by that sort of vision, and the idea that there were these mysterious men who knew, the hidden masters or the unknown superiors. I mean, in Masonic lore, there are these figures, these high-ranking Masons who their identity was secret, sort of like Mr. X, Mr. Big in the background.
And you had to take a vow to follow their every command.
Yeah, you had to vow to complete obedience to them and all that. And she just became fascinated with trying to find these people. And so that's what she did. She hightailed it out of this marriage she didn't want to be in anyway. And first she went to Constantinople, and then Cairo, and then around, Eastern Europe, and then all over the place.
I want to talk about her travels in a second, because even if you took out all of the occultism and her abilities and so forth, her travels around the world alone are pretty incredible. But before we go into that, I just want to, talk about her early mentions of this so-called hidden protector, her guardian angel, if you were to put it that way. Describe to us, who she claimed to see in dreams and visions.
Well, in 1851 in London, when she was about 20 years old, she said that she met here this character who she called Master M, Master Moria. And there's different versions of their meeting, but the most one that's accepted is that there was a big exposition here called the Great Exposition of 1851, and it took place in Hyde Park. And
with the Crystal Palace, right?
Yeah, the Crystal Palace.
Crystal Palace and all that. Yeah, so while walking there with her, she was here with like her godmother or something like that, Countess somebody or other, I can't remember right now. She saw this tall Hindu look at her from across the room or across the park or something, and she realized this was the face of this mysterious Hindu who came to her in her dreams, and also saved her life on a couple occasions. There's one story when she was riding a horse, and she was falling off the horse, and she was sort of hanging down by her legs, and she was going to get her head trampled, and this mysterious hand appeared and sort of kept her, raised her head up so it wasn't getting stomped on by the horse's hooves. Wow. And then there was another story where in one of the big houses that she lived in, she saw these paintings high up on a wall, and she wanted to see who they were, and she couldn't get to them, and so there wasn't a ladder. So she was a little girl, so she stacked all these sort of chairs and things and pieces of furniture to get up to them. And just as she got up there, the whole rickety kind of pile of things started to shake, and she was about to fall, and then she suddenly mysteriously finds herself back on the floor, and everything's okay. And so this mysterious Hindu intervened in her life in different times, and then she later realized this was the person who she saw in 1851 was the same character that she knew from her dreams and from these other experiences. And then she had further encounters with him, and he's the master who gives her mission in her life, which was to sort of reintroduce the ancient Hermetic occult philosophy into the increasingly materialistic and godless and spiritualless West. And then he also gives her this challenge where she has to go find his sanctuary in Tibet, where she studies for 7 years and so on, and masters her secret powers and so on. So it's a fantastic story. I mean, whatever you might think of, okay, well, how true is this and all that? Whatever you think of that, it's still a really a ripping yarn, as they used to say. So
I want to go back to the masters, because what I find so fascinating is that they're not, simply this ethereal thing. They're actually physical men that she meets on occasion. But also the fact that she makes those travels, like getting out of Europe and making her way to Egypt. At the time, she was a very young woman. How did she find the means to make these huge trips across the world? I mean, did she have any external help? How did she pay for it? How did she achieve this at such a young age?
Yeah, well, she came from a fairly well-off family. So there's different reports. Initially, there's the suggestion that her estranged husband was sort of financing her, sending her money, her father sending her money. And she also knew different people in these different places, these different cities. So she had kind of contacts through family. So as I said, like she's traveling with her godmother, then she'd be with her aunt or so on and so on. But also at different times she worked. She was very handy. She set up an ink factory somewhere. She, made a kind of ink that she sold. She set up an artificial flower factory, making sort of, plastic or whatever the equivalent paper sort of flowers at the time. At one point in Russia, she was log rolling.
Log rolling? Well,
there was this stuff called spunk that grew. It was a kind of fungus that grew on these particular trees in the area she lived in. And this was something that was very flammable, and it was something that was used to, kind of start fires, and so she figured out a way to be able to transport it. She's a good example of, we talk about mystics and occultists, and people tend to think, oh, okay, well, if anything, these people are, they got their head in the clouds and they're completely impractical. And she was a total opposite of that. She lived by her wits many ways too. And then for years, once she got sort of going, she lived by journalism. She wrote an enormous amount. I mean, her books are enormous, but then she wrote reams and reams and reams of articles and essays and short stories for different newspapers in Russia, in the States as well. So there's no indication anywhere that she fleeced any people, any of her followers, which is always a thing that people bring up. Okay, these phony gurus, they must be doing it for the money. Yeah. But there's no sign of that anywhere where she basically, it was all her own earnings. She's very different too, because she didn't take on all these titles. You get a lot of these people like Crowley. He was always taking on another Masonic title, or the Grand High Poobah or whatever, and trying to impress people with these. And she was always very, very much blue collar, to put it that way. She didn't nothing to do with that. And she identified really with sort of what we would call working class kind of people. She had very progressive, liberal, I wouldn't say socialist, but very sort of democratic sensibilities. So yeah, she worked. She worked a heck of a lot. She worked to the end of her life. I mean, she basically kept herself going to finish her books.
Well, let's go back to the mission she was given, because that, I guess, plays into the further travels that she made. Was she essentially then, still searching for that spirituality to bring back to the West? Because we know that, she traveled to India and to South America. Was she still trying to, find the pieces of that puzzle and then to complete that mission? Well,
yeah. I mean, you can see her life. In a way, it fits very much into accounts of other magicians from earlier times. Many of them, traveled around. They would wander all over. I mean, she had the advantage of steamships. Yeah. Where people hadn't had that earlier, a century or two earlier. But no, she did. By the time she had met the master and had met all these different people in different parts of the world who she was learning from. The next step of it was for her to get to Tibet, where she would actually study. And so
we think about that today. I mean, we think about traveling to Tibet and think, oh, that's okay. It's tough. Yeah, it's on lockdown. The Chinese have got it on lockdown, but you can go.
Then.
But
no, well, back then it was in the first place, it was almost impossible for white European men to get in there. So the idea of this overweight, crazy Russian woman, again, just to say about her character, we talk about her being sort of a mystic and a spiritual teacher, but she had this irascible, volatile, very wild character. So she didn't suffer fools gladly. She had no patience with idiots, and she would let people know. And she had a vocabulary that would put most men to shame. Smoked cigarettes constantly. So she was a real character in herself. So, and I think once she became Madame Blavatsky, and everyone knew who she was generally about 200 pounds. So she was
right.
Overweight, smoking cigarettes all the time, and foul mouth.
Right, so we have this 200-pound Russian woman, chain smoking away to Tibet. How does that happen?
Exactly. How does that happen? So you have to think, well, I don't know. That sounds a bit, hard to swallow. But I say in the book, I don't know. Dear reader, I leave it up to you. You have to decide whether there's enough sort of circumstantial evidence to suggest it was possible that she might have got there. But most of the accounts suggest that no, she couldn't have. What she probably did do was get into areas that are called Little Tibet, Ladakh, parts of northern India that sort of border, Tibet proper. And at that time, were kind of considered to be, sort of like New York, that you would say the New York area.
Right,
so
right.
Wouldn't be Manhattan proper, but you would be around there. So
there was some circumstantial evidence you pointed out in there. Like people had seen, years earlier, this European woman, this white woman traveling on her own in the area. Yes. There was some circumstantial evidence, right?
Yeah, there certainly was. And there's enough to suggest. And things like if she was going to make it up, why didn't she say that she got to Lhasa, which was the forbidden city? And she never claimed to get there. But you think, oh well, if she's going to make this all up, she might as well be hung for a sheep or for a lamb or whatever the saying is. So she might have gone the whole hog. And yes, I was in Lhasa and I sat at the foot of the Dalai Lama and so on and so on. No, she doesn't say that. She said she got to this monastery near Tashi Lumpo, which is a famous Tibetan Buddhist monastery. There was another monastery next to that, close by, where she lived with her masters. There were two of them, Master Moria, another one named Kudhumi, who taught her, how to master her sort of psychic powers, and also taught her this secret language called Dizyan and all this kind of stuff. And the thing is, like, Blavatsky is responsible. You say today people go to Tibet and all that. Well, a lot of the reasons people think of even going to Tibet is because of her. Not directly, but in the sense that she transported what we in the West call, Tibetan Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism, the popular form of Buddhism that, movie stars and celebrities and rock stars get into and all that. She's the one who sort of transported that over in the sense of popularizing it in her writings. Now, she has her own peculiar version of it. No Buddhist scholar recognizes anything that she calls Buddhism as Buddhism. But it was her and her immediate followers who basically established what we would call popular Buddhism in the West. Like the Tibetan Book of the Dead that's been a popular sort of spiritual text for a good 30, 40 years now. And it was put together by a guy named Evans Wentz, and he was a theosophist. Some other early Buddhist translations were done by we haven't said Theosophical Society is this esoteric spiritual organization that Madame Blavatsky started in 1875 in New York. And it became immediately very, very popular at the time. And so a lot of people were introduced to all the kinds of things that today in the New Age and kind of, alternative spirituality or alternative religion, we're very familiar with. On the high street, you have, yoga centers and stuff like that. Well, she's the one who kind of brought it all together, made it into a nice package, and turned it into a religious movement that became global. Went from New York to India to Europe. Yeah,
it's surprising how much, that Western knowledge that we have now, we owe to her in the end, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I felt that what I wanted to establish in the book is like whether, in a sense, I'm not particularly interested in theosophy. I'm interested in her. I'm not so interested in the teachings as in the phenomena that she was and her impact on Western culture and Western, whatever you want to call it, spiritual or intellectual history, because she definitely has a place that has been obscured because of her wild, crazy life and the whole idea that she was accused of being a fraud at a certain point.
Speaking of that, you said in Tibet that she mastered her powers, so to speak. Was there any evidence when she returned to Russia after a period of time and, saw her family again? Was there any evidence that they saw a change in her in regards to these abilities?
Yeah, well, the way the story is that she would periodically return, to show up on her sister or aunt's doorstep. And she would have a little bit more control. I mean, when she was younger, things would happen around her that she couldn't control at all, the raps and sounds and funny noises and so on. And then she seemed to be able to do it at will. And there's a story where after quite a few years of wandering again, she's back and she's visiting her father and her brother, who by this time is he's in university. He's very skeptical, rational, new modern thinking, modern westernized kind of guy, and he completely doubts in everything that she's saying. And she basically points to like a little table, a little coffee table kind of thing, and says, I can make that so heavy that you wouldn't be able to lift it. And he says, oh, this is just impossible. And so he goes over and picks it up very easily. And then she stares at it, and there's all these descriptions of her eyes and all that. And so she stares at it, and then she says, now try to lift it. And he couldn't lift it. This is the story. He couldn't lift it. His friend couldn't lift it. The two of them together couldn't lift it. And then she let it go, as it were. And then suddenly it jumped up in the air, and he almost dislocated his elbow, whatever. So there's various different and there's another story where she visited in the Orthodox Church, one of the leading sort of clergy is called the Metropolitan. So she met the Metropolitan of, I forget wherever it was, Kiev or someplace, wherever they were, because she's traveling all over Russia as well as all over the rest of the world. And she performs all these little things around him, making little noises and all this kind of stuff. And he gives her his blessing, and in a way that this little story is to show the church isn't against her, and the church recognized that she's a good guy. She's not a witch or a bad magician.
I enjoyed how she had a certain correspondence with her aunt. I think in the book you describe her aunt receiving a letter from Helena in an envelope, and then the guy that delivered it was an odd-looking Asian man who then suddenly dissolved in front of her.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the first place, getting a letter delivered by a Hindu in the middle of Russia somewhere was strange enough, and then then he just disappears. So again, a lot of those reports are retrospective. This is the odd thing and the difficult thing in trying to write a biography of her, is that there's some corroborable early accounts, and then when she goes on her long Wanderjahre, her years of traveling, it's very, very difficult to corroborate lots of things. And then when she shows up again, basically she becomes who we know of as her in about 1873, and she sort of surfaces in New York. She's about 42. She's come over on an immigrant ship, turns up in New York, is living in a women's hostel in the Lower East Side, sewing, from some little tailor to make a few rubles. And
she's chain smoking and she's ginormous.
Yeah, chain smoking. And she's this fantastically colorful, romantic character. Journalists are drawn to her, and they're writing about the immigrants coming to the States anyway. And so she becomes this celebrity. So she's in all the newspapers. And then you hear all these reports from her aunts or sister, oh, yes, I remember how Helena, when she was little, this happened and that happened. You don't hear anything about that earlier. You hear about it later on. So again, it's enough to say, well, okay, let's keep an open mind about this. Maybe it's being embellished. Maybe it's fiction. Maybe it's true. But that was sort of how, yes, they suddenly remembered receiving letters from these mysterious Hindus and things like that.
Yeah, right. I wanted to talk about how she seemed to be at odds with the other mediums of the time. Crowley, for example, and other figures. She certainly didn't agree with how mediumship was, taking place, how popular it was. She seemed to think that there was a certain truth behind it that the rest of the world didn't realize.
Well, again, it becomes complicated. Part of her mission, being sent back into the godless West, was to prove the reality of the phenomena taking place at seances and spiritualist gatherings, but to show that the explanation for them was untrue, the source, which the spiritualists saying was the dead, the spirits of the dead, of the spirits of your dear departed uncle or grandmother or so on. And she was saying, no, that's not true. And just to backtrack a little bit, spiritualism became this huge craze in both the States and in Europe in the late 1840s, and it carried on until into the early 1870s. And it was something that was, again, we might think of it as some crazy thing that a handful of people did, but it was enormous. It was, Abraham Lincoln was into it. It was something that everybody was sort of doing. It
was like instead of going to the movies, you went to see
went and had a seance. Yeah. And so she comes into the picture on the crest of that in the early 1870s in New York. But the thing is, she was different. She wasn't a medium because she was a magician in the sense that she had control. She wasn't passively letting herself being used as basically a voice for these spirits, from the other side who would come into the mediums and speak to them. She was commanding. She was able to make these things happen. So there's a famous story where she meets her sidekick, basically, this guy, Colonel Olcott, who was an American Civil War. He wasn't a hero, but he played a very, very important part in the Civil War. He was an investigator into Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So he wasn't an idiot. He wasn't a gullible fool. He was actually quite a competent character. But he was writing a series of newspaper articles about a series of spiritualist happenings in a farmhouse in Vermont. She's read his articles, so she goes there on purpose to meet him. So she wants to recruit him basically to her mission and use him as her PR man basically. And when she's there, she suddenly can command the spirits to appear. So you were getting all these Red Indians and sort of local Yankee kind of types, and suddenly all these Russians appear. These Russian spirits or these Central Asian kind of characters, Tibetans start to appear. And she claimed that she was able to control the spirit, the visions coming through the medium. And this is her whole thing, is that it wasn't passive, it was actively learning how to master your will and to master your powers and all that. And so she thought it was actually quite a decadent practice, spiritualism, because you gave up your free will, you gave up your own individuality to these other forces. And this is why it becomes complicated, because she wants to say, yes, these spiritual things are true, but it isn't the dead who are doing it. And all the mediums who are doing, in one sense, they were doing good business. In another sense, they had their own belief. She became kind of public enemy number one to them.
Well, you said in the book, I like this, you said she maintained that the spirits contacted during seances were a species of astral hobo, psychic tramps looking for mischief, really low-level stuff. I found that really interesting that she, wanted to confirm that the activity was real, but it wasn't necessarily what people thought it was.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, she basically was a bunch of, she described them as sort of shells, kind of like psychic remnants of people left behind. Because in her vision, again, this is what makes her, I think, very important, because she united this kind of spiritualist, occult kind of vision with the new ideas about evolution and science coming from Darwin and all that. And, again, by the time that she appeared on the scene, Darwin was still very relatively new, and there was still lots of, the Scopes monkey trial wasn't until the early 20th century, so there was still a lot of resistance to Darwin's ideas, and they were still considered rather radical. But she wedded this notion of evolution, this ongoing stream of change and process, to this occult kind of tradition. So she said, like, when we die, we don't just go hang out in heaven, and have nothing better to do than wait for somebody to try to call us and ask us how we're doing at a seance. We carry on, and our soul, our spirit carries on and transforms and goes on to, further and further kind of evolutionary changes. And in fact, for her, every little thing, every living thing is involved in this vast cosmic universal state of process. And so she spells that out in books like Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. So yeah, for her, what spiritualists were contacting were kind of these leftover bits of people's personalities that were kind of shed when they, like a snake sheds its skin. The dead departed shed this old personality of theirs and carried on. But this kind of stuff that was left behind, it could kind of gather together and become kind of semi-personality, almost a full individual, but it liked nothing better than to be able to come back into the world, able to manifest again.
This must have made her unpopular with the mediums of the time, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So there was a kind of feud going on. She battled. She had a three-front battle. I mean, she battled against materialist science. That was her main mission, was to show that this rising materialism, which is our basic default setting today for how we see the world, was mistaken. To argue against the kind of sclerotic, constricting hold of the church on people's minds and lives and all that, and also against the spiritualists. So she had her work cut out for her, and it's very easy to confuse. It's very easy to lump her in with the spiritualists, because basically talking about the same thing. So,
speaking of Isis Unveiled, her first book, I want to talk about the process of writing that, because there's some, intriguing information here as to her process and how she went about this work. You note that her family members often spoke of, actually she wrote to her family members speaking of a second consciousness inside her. She spoke of a lodger who's inside me. And it seems like this took place in her work as well, almost as if she had this split personality going on.
Yeah, there is a suggestion that she had this kind of other self. It goes back to when she was stories about it when she was, young, and then with her family. And the most vivid accounts of it are from her companion, Colonel Alcott, while they were living together in New York, sharing apartments together. He would watch her as she was working. And he actually claimed that she, her appearance changed, her hair changed, her face changed. But there's all this sense that she had this kind of second personality that she could somehow allow to come out, and it would write, some of the passages. And they're sort of textual analysis of the writings when they say, well, actually this passage is very different than this one, and this couldn't have been written by the same person. And in the book, I draw on some accounts of multiple personality in which this suggested, and that this is a possibility. And I think something tied in with this was this cigarette smoking with her all the time. Another thing, she was always playing solitaire. They called it patience back at the card game. People have said she got through a pound of tobacco a day. Now, nobody can get through a pound of tobacco in a day without keeling over, I think. So I think what she must have done was like roll, and it was all roll-ups. So she's rolling a cigarette, I think she'd probably roll it up, light it, take a few puffs, and put it out, or something like that. But I think that practice of rolling the cigarette itself somehow could focus her conscious mind. It was some purposeful but not particularly important activity that she would become kind of focused on, and it somehow allowed this other part of herself to have free reign. It could float around. And the same thing with playing solitaire. There's all these accounts of when people, in her last days in London, people would come to see her. She would have these sort of open houses, and they would come and ask her questions and all. And she was always sitting at a table, and she was always playing solitaire while people around her asking her questions and all that. So again, I think it's this kind of thing where she was able to somehow distract her everyday conscious mind by this kind of activity, and it would allow this other thing to come out. But there's some remarkable, accounts of her actually, looking like a totally different person. I mean, some of the things, again, you have to sort of take it on faith, or you think this is just completely crazy. I mean, I can only mention some of the remarkable, unbelievable things that... I've
got some great excerpts written down in your book, which we might, Aaron and I might go through those after our interview today. But the other thing I found fascinating was this ability of hers to somehow retrieve quotes from books and libraries that she had no physical access to, and her publishers were always, bamboozled by the amount of quotes she had, and they couldn't figure out how she was getting them.
Well, again, she read an enormous amount. The story is that when she would be writing, and again, this is back in the day with a pen. She wrote in pencil on sheets of paper, so it's not obviously a computer or even a typewriter. She would suddenly stop and kind of look up and gaze into the middle distance. And then you can imagine her face going, oh, yeah, that's it. And then she would go and finish the quote. Alcott said she would sort of see the passages in the astral plane. They would kind of appear to her.
Wow.
Passages from these books. And it's either books that she read ages ago, and she had a tremendous, almost like photographic memory of them, or they were books that she didn't have. I mean, it's sort of the equivalent today of Google. Like I know when I'm writing something here and I don't have the book in front of me, I can go to Google Books or something, and half of the time you can get the page that you're looking for. And it's sort of like that.
So it was like an astral Google.
Exactly, yeah. But she had this ability to sort of do it just through her own imagination, through her own inner perception. And there are all these accounts of her asking people to go check on some of these passages to make sure she got the references right. And there's one book that was in the Vatican Library that she could not have ever had any access to, and somehow she knew somebody who had access to the Vatican Library, and they went and they checked, and yes, indeed, it was absolutely correct. So there's all these remarkable things. I mean, I try to come up with some halfway plausible, not explanation, but this maybe this will help. And so this whole notion of what's called eidetic memory, where people have this kind of ability to visualize something in 3D almost, and it's like it's right in front of them.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Tesla had that ability.
Nikolai Tesla, yeah, he could sort of see a pattern, of a whole kind of electrical circuit board or something, and then boom, then just do it. So maybe she had something like that. And I mean, this became controversy after her death. There was a guy named William Coleman, I believe, who was a spiritualist who was anti-Blavatsky, and he basically wrote a long hostile article about her, saying how she plagiarized all this kind of stuff and claiming that she could never have had access to all these kinds of things and so on and so on. But I think the thing with Blavatsky is that she read a heck of a lot. She wasn't necessarily a logical, sequential thinker, but she was an enormously vital and exciting one. What her achievement was to synthesize all of this stuff into a single kind of package. And I was going to say it came at the right time, because it came at the time when the church was losing its ability to withstand the rising materialism and godlessness of science. Suddenly you have this strange woman appearing, starting this society, Theosophical Society, and people like Thomas Edison joined in the early days. And then one of the last people who she met was Gandhi. But before he was Gandhi, when he was basically here in London trying to be Ben Kingsley, he was trying to be an English, gentleman. He completely rejected his whole, Indian heritage and all that. And he was reintroduced to Hindu sacred writings. The Bhagavad Gita became the most important book in his life through meeting Blavatsky. So she had an enormous influence on people.
And her first book, Isis Unveiled, it turned out to be a huge overnight success.
Oh, yeah. It sold out, I think, the first week. And, it was what we would call a bestseller. And again, another example of how she wasn't in it for the money was the publisher said, would you mind unveiling Isis a bit more? This, basically, we've sold out, made a lot of money. I'll give you, I think it was something like $5,000 advance, which at the time was, enormous. And she said, no, my mission is done here. I've done the work I was set out to do in this book, and I have to go on to something else. So she turned down, God, today, if anybody offered me, like, would you write some more about this and I'll give you a big advance? Of course you say yes, So she was not in it for the money. I think she was absolutely sincere. And again, another thing that gets missed is that, yes, there's all this occult and paranormal and mystical kind of stuff, but one of her main aims was to start this kind of international brotherhood of humanity, this kind of universal brotherhood of mankind idea.
Right.
This is what attracted Gandhi to her initially. He wasn't interested in any of the occult sort of stuff, but this whole kind of notion of a what we would call multicultural, multi-faith, pluralistic, tolerant brotherhood of people of all different races. That's what her main motive was behind the Theosophical Society. And that comes out of her Masonic roots. This was something that was an aim of the early Freemasons in the late 18th century. It's not, Freemasonry today is a different kind of thing, and it's mostly like an old boys club and, business contacts and all that. But then it had this kind of really utopian progressive vision.
The pursuit for perfection.
She was really... Exactly, yeah. She was really moved by that.
I wanted to ask you specifically about the Mahatma letters, because this is kind of what I was up to in the book today, and I got a feeling this was leading to perhaps not a crumbling, but almost her reputation getting sullied towards the end of her life. What exactly were the Mahatma letters, and what did they lead to?
Well, Mahatma means great soul in India. The people who she called the masters, they're the same as the Mahatmas. They just started, when they moved to India, and she moved to India in 1878, set up camp there until about the mid-80s. So they started using the term Mahatma rather than master. And these were these letters, actual handwritten letters, that would appear out of nowhere, basically. They would float down from the ceiling. They would just appear on somebody's dressing table. They would show up somehow having been delivered, to your door without gone through the post office. They materialized out of thin air mostly. And they were messages from the masters, from this Master Moria, Master Kudhumi. They wrote in different colored ink. I think Master Moria wrote in red and Kudhumi wrote in blue. And they were sort of occult spiritual instructions, various different ideas about, mystic path and so on, or about how to set up the organization of the Theosophical Society. There was one series of them that were written to this one Brit guy, A.P. Sinnott, Alfred Percy Sinnott, who was an editor of The Pioneer, which was the biggest newspaper in India at the time. And he wanted to make direct contact with the masters. And they told him, and she told him, actually, you got to go through me. But they did start this correspondence with him. And there's like 1,500 pages of correspondence of fine-tuned, very specific, detailed instructions in occult philosophy, but also in setting up the Theosophical Society, and just in reflections on society, reflections on the Raj, reflections on the British. And again, this is a time when what was called the Great Game was going on between Britain and Russia in India for influence in that part of the world. And this is so Blavatsky was considered by many Brits to be a Russian spy, even though she didn't like the Brits, but she thought the Russians would have been much worse for the Hindus anyway. So she didn't want them in there either. And then another series of Mahatma letters were in Adyar in India, where they set up the Theosophical kind of camp, and it's still there today. She had what was called the occult room, where she had a little cabinet, and people would write questions to the masters and give them to her. She would put them inside the cabinet, and then however amount of time passed, usually pretty quickly, she would open it up. Their letter would be gone, and a letter from the masters would be there somehow. And so, long story short, you're right to sense that this is sort of the beginning of the downfall, is that what had happened is that an old friend of hers from her earlier sort of freewheeling days in Cairo turned up at the doorstep, was destitute, needed help. Helena, can you help me? And so Blavatsky was an enormously generous character, but she was a poor judge of people. So she often befriended and was very helpful to people that later turned on her. So this particular friend became part of the household there and was kind of like, taking care of the house and running things and so on and so on. And she increasingly became resentful, I think, towards Blavatsky's increasing success. The story is that she claimed that she had a series of letters from Blavatsky herself, between the two of them, basically spelling out how they're going to hoodwink everybody about the masters and how they're going to fake all these sorts of things. And along with the letters, there was also appearances of the master, like the masters would suddenly appear strangely, to people, and then they disappear. They wouldn't be able to find them. And so in this series of letters that this woman claimed that Blavatsky wrote, all that's kind of was spelled out. And in a fit of pique, in a fit of resentment and jealousy, whatever, she gave these letters to a Christian missionary magazine in India at the time. Now, as you might expect, Blavatsky alienated all the Christians there, the missionaries.
Of course, yeah.
In the first case, she's very anti-Christian. The second place, she was telling the Hindus, forget about the Bible. Read the Bhagavad Gita, read the Upanishads, go back to your own culture. Forget about becoming Christian and westernized. We have come to you. This is why they were so successful in India, because you have these two whites, a Russian and an American, coming and basically, don't try to be like us. We want to learn from you. And so the Hindus love them. And so the Christian missionaries were quite happy to get this ammunition against her, and they printed these letters, or they printed claims about them. And this gradually led to Blavatsky being considered a fraud. Very soon after this, the Society for Psychical Research, which had recently been established in England in the early 1880s, they sent one of the representatives to investigate the Mahatma letters and all that. And he didn't do a particularly good job investigating. He basically just interviewed people, and he assumed from the beginning that it was a fake and that Blavatsky was a Russian spy. He handed in a long report that said, she was one of the most brilliant and clever imposters of all time, and most likely is a Russian spy. And this drove her through the roof. She didn't care about being considered a fraud, but she hated the idea that word was going around that she was a Russian spy. This was something that she really hated. And from then on, she kind of spent the last, she died in 1891. She spent the last 7 years of her life kind of wandering in Europe, finishing this last huge book, The Secret Doctrine. And from about 1888 to 91, she lived in different parts of London.
Do you think we would have the modern New Age movement if not for Madame Blavatsky?
No, I think in the sense of, it's a kind of thing where, people interested in this sort of stuff and, it may have emerged. But no, I don't think so, because, as I say, she repackaged the rejected Western tradition of esoteric occult knowledge, the whole philosophy of Hermeticism and the Kabbalah and the Rosicrucians and all this kind of stuff. She pulled it together, gave it a coherent kind of history where it linked together, and was showing how at the time, developments in modern science in 1860 paralleled in many ways, things that the ancients knew, and the ancients probably knew more about it than we do. And then with the move to India, as I said, she basically opened the channel for popular version of Buddhism to flood the West. And no, you wouldn't have people, into Tibetan Buddhism like Richard Gere and famous actors and celebrities being into it without her, because she's the one that introduced it. All the early people translating Buddhist texts in the early 20th century came out of the Theosophical Society.
Wow, interesting.
That's a bone of contention these days, because you have Tibetan scholars saying, well, actually, there's no such thing as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There isn't, in Tibetan itself, there is no text called that. There are these different texts that are used, for dealing with death and so on and so on. But this guy Evans Wentz put it together and gave it that title, and so she's still a controversial figure. That's why I call her the mother of modern spirituality, because I think she introduced this whole kind of grassroots movement that's been with us now for a century and a half.
Absolutely fascinating life, and I'm so glad that you gave it justice, because it seems like a lot of the previous biography attempts have focused on, or just simply brushed her off as some kind of fraud. But you really went in depth on this one. And Aaron and I think you left something out though, and you touched on it, but we thought this was perfect, because you mentioned that in Tibet they have the technique called the long gom, which is
right.
trance walking, right? And we figured this out. This is how Blavatsky actually got into Tibet. And the long gom technique is trance walking. This is for our audience. So you're essentially walking on air, bounding along. And the French explorer Alexander David Neal described seeing this of Tibetan masters covering huge distances and leaping in huge single bounds. We can see Blavatsky 300 pounds with a cigarette in each hand, striding the Himalayas. There's got to be a second edition.
I'll have to add that in to the next edition. I'll have to add your guys' speculations in there. But yeah, hey, who knows?
I think that's how she did it, Gary. Come on.
I think she would appreciate that, and she's probably laughing right now. She has a very good sense of humor.
I wanted to ask you what you're working on next. I know you've got a book coming up very soon.
I'm working on a book about Aleister Crowley now, who was probably the most famous magician of the 20th century. Another very wild character, very different from Blavatsky. Blavatsky was teetotal. She smoked, but she didn't drink, and she was celibate. She claimed never to have ever had sex, and she even had a gynecological report at one point proving that it was Virgo intacta.
What did she say? What was her metaphor? That she had a fire in her mind and
crooked cucumber in there, and nothing could get in there anyway.
That wasn't the one I was thinking of. I was thinking of where she says she's got a volcano in her brain and a glacier down below.
Glacier down below, yeah, that's what she said. Yeah, when she's early days writing, she said no one was less interested in that kind of passion than I was. I had a raging volcano in my brain and a glacier down below, and apparently no one melted the glacier, as far as I can tell. This is another thing. Her critics say, during the time when she claimed to be in Tibet and in India and traveling around the world, she was actually wallowing in the flesh pots in Europe. And if it's difficult to imagine, Blavatsky hiking up the Tibetan Trail, it's equally difficult to imagine her wallowing in the flesh pots, because, she was an enormous woman. Some people have, rather unique tastes, but I think it would have been, she wouldn't be catering to too many. So Crowley's a different character altogether, mostly because of his enormous drug taking and his polymorphous perversity. And he was reinvented or rediscovered in the 60s by people like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all that. So,
can you reveal to us your thoughts on the entity known as Lam?
Oh, well, I think he's one of these pretty-human intelligences that Crowley claimed to have contacted with, but I think it's probably a part of his fragmented psyche. He was very many different people. He had quite a few different alter egos, and then this is actually funny thing. These people are now, academia would have turned their nose up at any of this stuff, 20, 30 years ago. Now it's the hottest item in the academic world.
Really?
It's just been Oh yeah, I'm reading a collection of essays put out by the Oxford University Press about Crowley, and the controversy is precisely the question that you just raised. Crowley claimed to have made contact with these sort of objective, extra-dimensional beings, but at the same time, he also claimed that magic was about sort of actualizing parts of your psyche that, or laying dormant. So, is it just part of his psyche? Was Aiwaz, who dictated the Book of the Law, which is Crowley's, kind of credo, his philosophy, was this just part of him, or did he really make contact with some, extra dimensional kind of creature? So I'll figure it out. I'll let you guys know.
Yeah,
and,
you're welcome back on the show anytime.
Pleasure. I think the thing with a lot of these people is that there's two camps. You have the books that are hagiographies by the true believers, and day one, nothing the character did was ever wrong. So from the minute Blavatsky was born to the minute she died, she was on the mystic path, and everything she did was, part of that. Or you get the people that just kind of dismiss her, as you say. And I'm just trying to find a middle ground, between them, sympathetic but critical, and thinking about the reader. What is the reader? Not trying to convince the reader of the truth of this or not, but just trying to basically tell a good story and discuss some of the ideas. So that's what I try to do. So if I did it with this book, then that's great. I'm happy.
Well, you did a great job, Gary. Congratulations on the book, and
pleasure.
Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and let's keep in touch, and thanks a lot to you both.